One moment changed everything inside Buckingham Palace forever. King Charles was mid-sentence delivering the most important speech of his reign when Queen Camilla suddenly rose to her feet and interrupted him in front of the most powerful figures in the British royal family. The room froze. People stopped breathing. And what happened in the hours that followed has been buried so deeply that the palace is doing everything in its power to make sure you never find out. Stay with us, because by the end of this story, you will never look at the British royal family the same way again. Welcome back to Gossip News Channel, the only place where royal secrets don't stay secret for long. If you're new here, please take 1 second to hit that like button and subscribe with your notifications on, because we are about to take you inside the most explosive closed-door meeting the House of Windsor has ever witnessed, and the mainstream media is completely silent about it. A bombshell leak from inside Buckingham Palace has sent shockwaves through the British media, revealing a closed-door meeting that is said to have plunged the royal family into its most tense crisis since the death of Queen Elizabeth II. In an atmosphere thick with pressure, King Charles III reportedly stood up and made a stunning declaration. He was prepared to hand over the future of the monarchy to Prince William and Princess Catherine while he was still on the throne. The move has been described as reckless, unprecedented, and one that could upend the established order of power within the royal family. But what no one saw coming happened just seconds later. Queen Camilla suddenly rose to her feet and interrupted the speech in front of the most powerful figures in the royal household. The room instantly froze. There were averted glances, tense hand-clenching, and then William was forced to step in to prevent the situation from spiraling completely out of control. However, the real shock came behind closed doors just hours after a mysterious private conversation between Charles and William. The king is said to have returned with a decision that is now irreversible, leaving Camilla isolated in the very heart of the institution where she once wielded her greatest influence. In the solemn and oppressive silence of the closed meeting room at Buckingham Palace, the pale golden light from the crystal chandeliers seemed tinged with anxiety. And finally, seated to the king's right was Queen Camilla, the woman who had weathered half a century of turmoil, rising from the harshly criticized third party to official consort and Queen of England. Camilla had always been Charles's sole emotional anchor, the one who understood the deepest vulnerabilities hidden in his soul. The atmosphere in the meeting room was thick with solemnity as King Charles III rose to his feet, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the edge of the polished oak table. He began speaking of duty, of the changing times, and of the urgent need to refresh the monarchy's image in the eyes of the public. Each word from the king struck like a hammer blow into history, confirming that he would not reign until his last breath like his mother, but would instead step aside proactively to make way for youthful energy. Charles's gaze turned toward William and Catherine with a mixture of trust and the quiet sorrow of a father placing a heavy burden on his son's shoulders. He spoke of their 3 children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, as the young shoots of the future who would carry on the legacy under the guidance of the young couple. However, just as the speech reached its most critical point, the official moment of the power transition, a jarring sound broke the air. Queen Camilla suddenly stood up. The action was entirely off script. Her face, usually composed in a gentle, sociable smile, had turned rigid and icy. She did not look at the others, but fixed her eyes directly on her husband. A terrifying silence descended on the room. Camilla spoke, declaring that the decision was too hasty and that the current political climate did not permit such a sudden change at the top of the institution. She emphasized William's lack of experience, implying that thrusting a young man into the leading role amid turbulent times would be a dangerous gamble for the survival of the monarchy. Camilla's move was like a bucket of cold water thrown into the face of the meeting's solemnity. Everyone present, from senior royals to the most trusted aides, was stunned into near breathlessness. What they saw was not the concern of a grandmother or a devoted wife, but the fierce resistance of someone who held real power and refused to relinquish it. The subtle shifts in her facial muscles and the calculating press of her lips revealed that she was fighting to protect her own position, the status she had spent a lifetime securing. King Charles stood frozen, his face flushed red with emotion only moments before, now drained to a deathly pallor from shock and hurt. The woman who had always supported him unconditionally had become the first to stab a knife into the greatest plan of his life right in front of his successor. When the heavy walnut door of the study closed, the private space instantly turned into a blazing arena. The king spun around, his usually gentle face now flushed with crimson fury. His hands clasped tightly behind his back to hide their trembling not from fear, but from a suppressed rage threatening to erupt. He stood beside the desk where family photographs and unfinished manuscripts lay and looked at Camilla as if she were a complete stranger. The silence stretching between them carried the weight of decades of intimacy, yet every passing second now felt like a blade severing that bond. Charles said nothing, but his ragged breathing and tightly pressed lips betrayed the depth of his wound. He could not believe that the woman who had stood by him through every storm, the only one who truly understood the pain of waiting, would humiliate him at the very moment he sought to fulfill his highest duty to the crown. In his eyes, Camilla's action was no longer the counsel of a devoted wife, but the manipulation of a power-hungry schemer. In contrast to her husband's silent explosion, Camilla displayed a calmness that was almost terrifying. She did not retreat. Every movement, from smoothing her dress to the proud tilt of her chin, radiated a clear message. She would not let the crown slip from her grasp so easily. To Camilla, Charles's abdication was not merely a generational handover, it was the end of the influence she had painstakingly built over half a lifetime. The wordless confrontation escalated as Camilla stepped closer. The physical distance between them shrank, yet the chasm dividing them grew infinitely wider. She began to wield her sharpest weapon, her intimate knowledge of Charles's darkest past. Her eyes suddenly shifted from defiance to cold menace. With pointed glances and gestures toward old mementos, she invoked the bleak years he had spent at Gordonstown boarding school. The place that had forged a lonely, scarred Charles and the memories he had always tried to bury. Camilla knew Gordonstown was hell in the king's mind, and she did not hesitate to stir those old wounds as a warning. Her gaze seemed to say that she possessed secrets capable of tarnishing the image of a dignified monarch, and that if he dared push her aside to make way for William, she was ready to drag those shadows into the light. The threat needed no words, yet it turned. When William entered, he found his father standing by the window, his slender fingers lightly touching the spine of an ancient leather-bound book. The silence between the two men carried the weight of deep understanding that required no explanation. Charles did not need to explain what had happened with Camilla. His haggard face and evasive gaze spoke of the fracture in full. The king gave a slight nod, motioning for his son to sit opposite him. In that moment, the distance between sovereign and heir seemed to dissolve, leaving only two men bearing the fate of an empire on the brink of upheaval. Charles began to lay out his wishes not with harsh commands, but with slow, thoughtful gestures. He opened a family tree chart on the table, his finger resting on the names of William and Catherine. His eyes held an urgent plea, a silent request that his son accept the crown sooner than planned in order to safeguard the monarchy's stability from personal ambitions that were threatening to consume it from within. For his part, the young prince was initially unable to hide his caution. His brows furrowed and his hands clasped tightly in his lap in a natural defensive posture. He understood the cost of assuming power at this moment. It was not merely the burden of state visits and elaborate ceremonies, but the need to confront the deep rift within the family itself, especially with Camilla. A woman he had only managed to accept on a formal level after many difficult years. William feared a media civil war and the damage to the royal image if the conflict between the king and queen were ever exposed. Yet as he looked into his father's unwavering gaze tinged with quiet desperation, William's hesitation began to fade. He realized Charles was not only seeking a successor, but a true ally to steady the royal ship before the storm unleashed by the person closest to him. William let out a soft sigh, releasing his reservations and replacing them with the resolve of a future king. He stood and placed a hand on his father's shoulder, a rare gesture that broke royal protocol but carried the strongest possible vow of solidarity. William's resolve grew even firmer throughout that morning as several key members of the royal family, those who had always maintained strict neutrality, discreetly sent signals of support for the king through trusted aides. Brief notes and subtle nods of agreement in the corridors made one harsh truth devastatingly clear to Camilla. She did not command the solid backing she had imagined. Her open resistance at the previous meeting had unintentionally driven other members toward Charles, as they placed the long-term survival of the monarchy above any individual queen's ambition. At the end of the meeting, King Charles walked to his desk, picked up his gold fountain pen, and wrote a short but ironclad directive. It was an order to convene a second closed meeting with an unchangeable agenda. This decisive act marked the end of the era in which Charles had yielded and shown weakness. He no longer glanced toward the door leading to Camilla's bedroom with any lingering expectation. Instead, he looked straight ahead to where William stood ready for an irreversible transition. The decision had been made, and this time no threat or past secret could stop the aging king from fulfilling his final duty. A new era had taken shape in the quiet of the library. Behind him, Queen Camilla entered with a carefully maintained expression of calm, but her hands clutching the small handbag betrayed her completely. Her fingers gripped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She sensed the shift in the atmosphere the moment she crossed the threshold. The light from the wall sconces no longer felt warm and welcoming. Instead, it seemed to narrow and focus on the center of the table where Prince William and Princess Catherine sat with an unnerving composure. Their presence was no longer that of children listening to their father, but of heirs ready to assume the fate of the monarchy. As the meeting began, the king did not wait for any formal opening. He placed a dossier bearing the royal seal onto the table with such decisiveness that it landed with a sharp, emphatic thud, causing Camilla to flinch visibly. His eyes swept once across the key members of the family council. Where there had once been hesitation, Charles now displayed an iron will forged in the fire of betrayal. He had no need for flowery language. Every gesture as he turned the pages of the documents and every nod to the legal advisors conveyed a single, clear message. This was no longer a discussion, but the announcement of an edict that could not be challenged or overturned. Camilla made one final attempt to turn the tide. She began to rise, intending to use her accustomed regal poise to interrupt or offer a delaying counterargument, as she had done before. But the moment she opened her mouth, she met only cold stares from around the table. The other members of the royal family, those who had once shown her deference or caution, now maintained a unified distance. They no longer looked to her for consensus. Instead, every gaze turned toward the king and William. This isolation unfolded in complete silence, yet it carried more destructive force than any open argument could have mustered. Realizing her resistance no longer carried any weight, Camilla slowly leaned back into her chair. The mask of confidence gradually slipped from her face, replaced by a stunned, bitter expression that she could not hide no matter how hard she tried. She stared fixedly at the dossier on the table. The detailed transition plan already signed and approved by the legal authorities and the Privy Council. The power she had painstakingly cultivated and the threads of influence she had once controlled were now slipping through her fingers like fine sand. The climax of the meeting came when the king officially rose and placed his hand on William's shoulder. It was a symbolic gesture of succession that needed no words to explain its meaning. William stood meeting his father's gaze with absolute respect and unyielding resolve. Camilla sat motionless, watching the scene unfold before her eyes. She understood that Charles's change was not a fleeting burst of anger, but a long, overdue yet powerful awakening of a sovereign who had finally chosen duty over sentiment. When the king brought the meeting to a close with a single, the change was most evident during the once private and warm breakfast the couple had shared for decades. Charles still sat in his usual place, but he no longer shared newspaper snippets or discussed charitable projects with Camilla. He buried himself in state files, his reading glasses slipping down his nose, and his eyes focused solely on numbers and clauses. When Camilla attempted to start a light conversation to ease the heavy silence, The king replied only with a vague nod or a distant glance, before rising and leaving earlier than usual. The gentleness and indulgence that had defined his treatment of her for half a century had evaporated completely, replaced by an impenetrable wall of ice that no amount of effort could melt. In her profound shock, Camilla tried every subtle social skill she possessed to regain her influence. She changed her style, choosing more elegant outfits, and proactively arranged small receptions at the palace in hopes of reclaiming the power slipping away from her. Yet every effort met with polite but firm indifference from Charles. Notes she sent to his desk were set aside without reply. During council meetings, whenever she tried to offer an opinion, Charles skillfully redirected the discussion toward William or the advisors, rendering her presence increasingly superfluous and faint like a candle being slowly extinguished. The rift could not remain hidden forever within the palace walls. Servants began to notice the queen's absence from the king's afternoon walks in the private gardens. Their eyes no longer met, and the discreet, intimate gestures that once existed between them had completely disappeared. Whispers spread from the basement kitchens up to the highest administrative offices. People quietly spoke of how the king now locked himself in his study until late into the night, while the queen frequently retreated to Mill House, her private estate in Wiltshire, under the pretext of resting, though in truth it was an escape from her husband's devastating coldness. The peak of this transformation came during a major public cultural event. Instead of the familiar image of the royal couple walking side by side, King Charles III arrived alone in his sleek Bentley. Camilla's unexplained absence amid swirling rumors felt like a silent confirmation of the breakdown that everyone had been whispering about. Standing before the crowd and the cameras, the king maintained a perfectly composed face, showing not the slightest trace of sorrow. He shook hands, chatted, and smiled at the public. But deep inside, it was the smile of a man who had accepted trading personal affection for the dignity of the crown. A trade that cost him everything, but the institution demanded no less. Behind the glamour of the ceremony, the press began raising uncomfortable questions about the true state of the royal family. Tabloids splashed headlines about the lonely king and the vanishing queen. Charles knew everything, yet he no longer cared. He had chosen the path of a true sovereign, where duty to the dynasty and to William's future outweighed all past emotions and fears. The distance between him and Camilla was no longer measured merely in miles between London and Wiltshire, but in the vast gulf between two souls that no longer looked in. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla's presence in London grew increasingly sparse until it nearly vanished altogether. She withdrew to Mill House, her private estate in Wiltshire, where rose gardens and sweeping green fields offered a hollow comfort to a soul enduring cold rejection. There were no longer bowing courtiers to greet her, and no meticulously arranged busy schedules to fill her days. Camilla spent most of her time in her private study, staring out the window with distant eyes that had seen too much. The fierce resistance she had mounted at Buckingham Palace now lingered only as the echo of a failed gamble that had cost her everything she had worked for. She realized that in the game of monarchy, even Charles's love, no matter how great and enduring, could not overcome the primal instinct to preserve the bloodline and legacy of a king. The relationship between Charles and Camilla now survived only through official documents and brief procedural phone calls. That fracture was the highest price the king had to pay to secure stability for his son's reign. Every time he appeared in public without the familiar figure of his wife beside him, Charles felt a vast emptiness inside. Yet he always concealed it behind an unchanging mask of regal composure. He had chosen to become a solitary transitional king so that William could emerge as a brilliant architect of a new era. At the most important moment of the official proclamation ceremony, William stepped onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace. He looked down at the sea of people below, a vast crowd cheering and waving colorful flags that stretched as far as the eye could see. Beside him, Catherine smiled radiantly, her eyes sparkling with pride and purpose. From this vantage point, William could see all of London transforming before him. A new era had truly begun, Yet behind the smiles and the brilliance he clearly felt his father's silent sacrifice and the painful fractures within the family that the public would never fully know. Charles remained behind the balcony doors, hidden in the shadows of the grand room, to give the young couple the full spotlight they deserved. He watched his son steady back and knew with absolute certainty that he had done the right thing. Every change came with loss, and power was a glittering ornament that was also a heavy chain. As the crowd's roar rose like thunder and a gentle breeze swept through the corridor, stirring the velvet curtains, William's era had officially opened, bringing with it the promise of hope